So, in 1967, the folks at the National Youth Brass Band Championships were like, I think we need a new piece for everyone to play, and then bam, Journey into Freedom was born. Eric Ball is considered one of the kings of the brass band world, and he really knocked it out of the park with Journey into Freedom, because the piece was then used in 1975 and again in 91 for the championship areas, as well as a ton of other contests across the world. The piece has also been referenced in a load of other works, such as Gregson's Rococo Variations, another great piece. So, all in all, good job, Eric. You did good. Now, disclaimer, Eric Ball was a Salvationist, and to get a really decent understanding of the piece, we need to look through the eyes of a Salvationist living in the 1960s. And I appreciate I was not around in the 60s, and nor am I a Salvationist, but that's not going to stop me. In a preview before the first outing of the piece at the Royal Albert Hall, Eric Ball had this to say. Whether they know it or not, today's competing amateur musicians, and the tens of thousands more they represent, are helping to keep open the windows of heaven. In this harsh materialistic age, focus on some unexpressed longings of the human heart. In the realms of the spirit, mankind's greatest victories can be won. May today's Brass Band Festival give us all hope and inspiration for these troubled times, as well as entertainment and happiness. Now, I never met Eric Ball, but that's how I imagine all composers to sound, regardless. Before we get into the actual music, I think it's worth checking out what he could have meant when he talks about troubled times, because I don't think there was a pandemic lacking about when this was written. So what was actually going on in 1967? So the first big thing was a little thing called the Cold War. Now, if you're not aware, this wasn't actually an argument that you'd have with your housemate about the temperature on the radiators, but it's actually a really long arms race which basically led to everyone in the world having their own personal stockpile of nukes. So that's fun. Pretty scary stuff, and in fact, 1967, the Chinese tested their very first hydrogen bomb, so it's easy to imagine everyone on edge. Other things going on with the 6-day war in Israel, the first heart transplant, and the first cryogenically preserved man, so little old Eric was a little concerned for everyone straying away from God's light. One of the key beliefs that I found on the Salvation Army website was, salvation depends on continued and obedient faith in Christ. So you can imagine that Mr. Ball wanted to reaffirm his spiritual beliefs. The gist of Journey into Freedom is that despite everything going on and everyone around the world abandoning their traditional values, love and fulfillment can still be achieved, and indeed will overcome it all. So let's get stuck into the music bit. Journey into Freedom is performed as one continuous piece, but it's split into 6 smaller movements, and the first one to kick it all off is
Moderato e feroce.
If you want to boil this movement down to 2 things, it's all about violence and materialism. The full band hits evoke a rigid, cruel and unyielding machine, and the crazy triplets just seem relentless in their onslaught. Check it out. This striking opening is why this test piece will prove to be one of the most memorable in years to come, and I think it's stood the test of time pretty well already. The triplets play this rising theme and want to carry on going up, up and up, but it's just dragged back down at the end to repeat itself, perhaps reflecting on the struggle against the materialistic world that just erodes away any kind of effort towards spirituality, therefore making the struggle kind of seem fruitless. Another point of interest in this opening section is the muted interjections at figure 2. The biting sound really cuts through the texture of the band and gives a cold and impersonal atmosphere to kick the piece off. Now, it is worth mentioning that this violent movement is in D minor, which is significant when we get to the end. Trust me. This movement eventually gives way to a march, or more,
Alla marcia.
which, if you want to be really, really picky, does mean in the style of a march, but come on, this is brass band. It's a march. Let's move on. This music is just filled with feelings of protest and revolt. Spitting in the face of the harsh opening, Eric writes a brilliant march of progress, full of resolve and astonishing levels of bravado and swagger. Just check this out. This theme, much like the triplets at the beginning, has a really nice rising feel to it, suggesting the rising of the spirit, but it can't quite break free from the reins of the first section, emphasised in the return of the triplets around figure 5. The cornet and tuba sighs here also show the desperation found in these trying times, as Eric mentioned, and the chromatic nature of this just makes the key kind of murky at this point. Chromatic writing can be used for tons of different reasons, one of which being to show uncertainty, and I think Eric's used it to show that there's no true sense of belonging here, coupled with a touch of conflict and a tasteful sprinkling of good melody construction. The main theme uses B naturals, E naturals against D flats, and G flats or F sharps, depending on how you want to look at it, all of which don't quite fit with the written key of A flat major. Now, it is worth mentioning that everything I'm going to be talking about is in concert pitch, and this is just to avoid a fight between the sops, horns, and half the bass section with the rest of the band. Minus you, the bass trombone, you're alright. We get a massive gear shift 6 before figure 7, where the music is clearly overjoyous, kind of over the top, and it just seems for a moment that we've lifted ourselves up and been triumphant over the hellscape that is the opening, but sadly it is quite short-lived. At figure 11, the music takes a really dark turn and slowly reverts back to the same music that we found when we started off on this journey, and it's only emphasised by the mechanical violence from the flutter-tonguing that cuts through the band found at figure 12. So we find ourselves right back where we started.
Moderato e molto feroce.
Those keen-eyed among you will realise that this is the exact same direction given at the top of the piece, but now with more ferociousness. Basically, this new section we've just heard before, but now it's got more emphasis. The dynamics and textures are played about with a little bit, simply reinforcing the troubled worlds that was home to the Cold War, and just the inner turmoil faced by knowing so many people were turning away from the central beliefs. Now we get to a really lush bit, Eric Ball's love theme. This was put to the words of a hymn written by Johann Scheffler, and the addition of Then Comes Freedom at the end. It starts with a beautiful cornet solo that's left to float freely above the band, and the soloist is given so much space to express themselves and really tug at the emotions of the listener. The solo here literally rises up from the previous section, almost as if Eric Ball is finally finding a way out of the darkness. Through human love, he is able to escape to freedom. The music here is driven mainly through the melody and soloist rather than the rhythmicness of the previous sections we've heard, as he sheds the mechanicalness and the materialism that surrounded him before. The march we heard earlier was just as rigid and rhythmically strict as the world he wanted to leave behind, so now he's really finding the true journey into freedom. Journey into freedom. That's the name of the piece. Yeah. The solemn bass theme at 18 evokes some of the previous material, but as a sort of operatic aria. It's similar material, but this time crying out, which sounds almost cathartic. From figure 19, the lines really start to intertwine and communicate with each other, showing people finally starting to work together rather than fighting in opposition. Another contrast with other sections we've heard so far is that there's no doubting the key of this. The music has finally found where it belongs. It's found its key centre. Now, next up we get
Allegro scherzando.
and this wild waltz that seems in high spirits and dances freely across the band. And it's very jokey, and in fact the literal translation from Italian is cheerful and joking. So that's kind of unsurprising. There's short-lived release through abandonment, true escapism from a terrifying world. This is incredibly pretty music as well, but there is an unsettling sense of darkness and foreboding within the light floaty melody. Some more chromatic writing also creeps in just before figure 21. And the quiet punctuation from the trombones isn't completely alien from those that we found at the beginning. Do also note that we've transitioned from A flat major to its more sinister brother of F minor as we hit the direction Abandonamente. That's the one. Here we let go of the materialist world once more, waltzing wild and free. Just listen to how lavish this music can get when a band like Black Dyke get a hold of it. Yet again, there's something still in the back of our minds. Art imitates life. And just as the Cold War was always a lingering threat, we get the return of darkness and terror at figure 25. Despite the freedom we once had, evil is still present. To transition to our final section, we get a lovely slow chromatic dirge from the basses, evoking similar feelings found in his other work Resurgam, or in the factories depicted in Philip Wilby's Lowry sketchbook. Followed by the rousing sounds of the love theme transformed into this glorious song of hope and freedom. The love and contemplation of the eternal has brought us up from the drudgery into long-lasting inner freedom that takes us to the end of the piece. Hurrah! The human race is still capable of enlightenment, in spite of what surrounds us. The lavish orchestration brings the piece full circle into a grand display of emotional strength and enlightenment. I mentioned earlier the piece started with a massive D minor chord, and in this extensive journey that we've been on, we've resolved rather triumphantly with an even bigger F major chord. This is the relative major to D minor, which is really rather satisfying, I have to say. Eric Balls managed to show the growth out of the darkness into the light, and at long last, we have completed our journey into freedom. Thank you for watching the first brief look at brass bands. This isn't meant to be a great in-depth guide or anything like that. There's plenty more to go into in Eric Ball's work, and after all, this is my take on what's written. But if you did like what you saw and want more of these kinds of videos, let me know in the comments, give the video a like, and head over to my Facebook page to stay in the loop of any updates that might come out. The links should all be in the description. I've been Tom, and this has been a brief look at Eric Ball's journey into freedom. Toodles!